They handed Anna an invitation like they were offering mercy. The envelope was thick, cream with gold embossing, the writing looped with a practiced grace. Anna, a black cleaning woman at the Hawthorne Tower, took it with the same careful hands that had polished every brass handle in the lobby, that had smoothed out glass until it stopped showing the fingerprints of the building's busiest lives. She read the calligraphy, felt the weight of the paper, and for a beat, let the polite smile do what it had always done. Absorb insult, keep working. Clara placed the invitation in her palm as if it were a favor. Clara's smile never reached her eyes. Around them, quiet laughter bubbled like a fountain. Clara made a small show of generosity. "We'd love for our staff to attend," she said in that sugar and venom voice, then tilted her head, curious to see how Anna would look among the chandeliers and champagne. The offer was dressed up as inclusion, but Anna saw the rim of it. A trap that asked for spectacle, where anyone back home could point and say, "There she is, the woman who cleans our floors." Anna tucked the envelope into her pocket. Her shoulders were steady. She bowed her head and went back to her work. She wiped the smudge from a marble step with emotion that had become almost prayerful. The world cleaned under her hands, and the world left her the same. The invitation hung in her mind like an unspoken question. They wanted a punchline. They wanted to make her small in public and use it as a joke. They wanted to turn a person into a performance. It had happened before, the way the rich sometimes sharpen themselves on the backs of those below. But something in Anna tightened. Not anger at first, but attention. She felt the history she carried pull inward like a breath. Her days were built of small repetitions, the clink of mop buckets, the whisper of vacuum motors, the hush between the elevators. People hurried past her, polishing their reflections on glass, nodding without seeing. She moved through grand lobbies and private parties and always kept herself measured. Anna had learned to listen more than she spoke, to read the architecture of a room the way some read faces. She knew where a coat might be set down, which photograph on the wall had been reprinted too many times. She knew the named donors of the gala, the sculpted names on plaques, the family histories recited in toasts. She had memories that did not belong to the person Clara and her circle assumed. In the quiet of the janitor's closet, where smell and dust made their own kingdom, her fingers brushed an old seam on the lining of her coat and found it loose. At home that night, she opened a small wooden box she had kept under an old towel for years. A box she had once meant to hide away, and then inexplicably had kept within reach. Inside, there were photographs. A younger Anna in a dress with a soft collar, standing beside a brick building with a sign that read, Adabio Foundation. There was a certificate with her name printed in a hand that suggested ceremony, the kind of thing given to founders whose faces were on brochures. There was a letter, the paper creased from being unfolded and refolded, from a woman named Janet who had been Anna's friend before the fall, before whatever had been said about the Adabio name, and before Anna's life narrowed to the broom and the apron. Anna sat at the edge of her bed and read that letter by the thin light of a kitchen lamp. Janet's handwriting was practical and warm. "If ever you find yourself in need," it said, "reach out. We will find you." The words felt like a map left on the table for a traveler who had lost her way. The photographs spoke softly. There had been meetings, grant panels, lunches where children were fed and classes started. Anna's face in the pictures was not the face of a woman who had always been invisible. She had once been someone who called meetings to order, who made decisions about who would get a scholarship and which neighborhood program would open next. Her name, Anna Adabio, had rung in rooms with other names, the kind that made people stand and listen. There had been a scandal, she knew in outline, a rumor that had spread, a lawsuit that had taken its toll, donors who stepped back, and eyes that found pleasure in watching a family's reputation erode. Anna's father had been a figure in a neighborhood that mattered. The foundation had been their way of translating influence into service. The scandal did not erase all that had been done. The gardens planted, the children taught, the after-school rooms, they remained, struggling perhaps, but real. What had been erased, for a long time, was the name attached to the effort. Anna let the photographs rest on her knees and felt a tiredness she could not scrub away. Not only from work, but from carrying past and present in separate compartments. as if one life had been sealed inside a box and another life had to make do in the open. Something in her shifted. Not a fury to match Clara's cruelty, more a recognition that she could choose the terms on which she carried herself. She could decline the invitation. She could accept. Either decision would say something. She thought of every time Clara had reduced her with a remark, how the wife of the tower's owner had made a casual habit of trimming people down to size at every party. She thought, too, of the children who walked past the foundation and looked at the empty rooms and wondered whether help still came. There was a balance to strike between dignity and erasure. Before she slept, Anna took the letter from Janet and dialed the number written on the back of the envelope as if dialing a lifeline. The line clicked. Then a voice, warm and surprised. "Anna?" Janet's tone was a thread tying the years together. "I thought—" "It's me," Anna said. Her voice was steady. "Janet, I have to ask you a favor." Janet did not hesitate. "I'll be there by noon," she said, as if noon could travel the years in one stride. She did not ask why. She remembered Anna as someone who had run organizations, not simply as a quietly efficient cleaner. That memory carried weight. Janet arrived in a small storm of color and crisp fabric. She owned a modest fashion house and wore her work like a proclamation, clothes that declared craft and care. She looked at Anna's coat, at the hands that had scrubbed the edges of light, and frowned, not at the coat, but at the economy of identity that had folded Anna into uniform. Her hands moved quickly, pulling out boxes that smelled faintly of cedar and polish. "This isn't about changing you," Janet said. "It's about reminding you you existed before they made you small." There was a ritual to it, a haircut that uncovered a jawline, a dress that fit as if it recalled her shape from memory, an old brooch from Janet's own vault that had once belonged to a woman who had fought a different fight. The brooch fit at the collarbone like a punctuation mark. They practiced the way Anna would walk into a room, shoulders back, chin level. Not a performance for anyone else's pleasure, but a posture reclaimed. Janet spoke practical things too, how to introduce herself, who to make eye contact with, a few phrases that announced presence without begging recognition. They wrote down Anna's full name and rehearsed it until it rolled from her like a sentence she had been waiting to say. Anna found that the sound of her own name in Janet's voice was unfamiliar and also right. "Anna Adabio," she said aloud, feeling the syllables settle. "I am Anna Adabio." It was a small private ceremony. The change was not in the clothes, but in the permission she gave herself to be seen. Janet pressed the letter from her into Anna's palm again, like a witness. When they left for the wedding, they did not take a carriage. They walked through the city the way people used to walk toward their own history, unhurried, visible. Passers-by glanced, some with curiosity, some with recognition of a face they could not place. A few smiles came easily, others narrowed. Anna felt the whisper of old places in her steps, the memory of boardrooms and fundraisers pairing themselves with the rhythm of her shoes. The venue was the Grand Magnolia, a garden estate where magnolia trees filtered light onto table linens, and where chandeliered tents made summer feel like a pageant. The air was a mixture of perfume and cut grass. Servers moved like rehearsed shadows among the tables laden with polished plates. Clara had chosen every detail, the silver that flashed like a challenge, the music that suggested good breeding and good taste, the guest list that read like a who's who. Anna stepped into the grounds with a quiet that made the crowd feel larger by contrast. Cameras clicked. Conversations tapered into a hush that felt almost like the space between heartbeats. Clara watched with the interest of a predator about to enjoy a spectacle. She had already arranged the joke in her mind. A woman in a uniform among the suits. A woman whose work was to keep the world shiny, suddenly present in their privileged air. People had expected a tableau. They had planned to point, to chuckle, to log the image into their private collections of a life confirmed superior by the presence of a servant. But the tableau did not assemble. Anna did not hurry. She moved with a humility that had been carved by experience, and with a firmness that belonged to someone who had once made decisions that affected many. Her attire was deliberate and understated, a black dress cut cleanly at the collar, a brooch that suggested another story. shoes that made the garden feel like a stage she had always meant to step onto. There was a slow, odd silence at first, the kind that happens when a room is waiting for the moment that will authorize reaction. Anna crossed the lawn, and when she reached the edge of the tent, she paused just long enough for those watching to reconsider the obvious. There is a particular power in not filling the silence with explanation. An older man in a linen suit seated near a table of donors looked up. He had the sort of face that suggested long attendance at galas and long memory for names. Something in the line of Anna's jaw, or perhaps the brooch at her collar, telescoped across time in his mind. He had signed checks for causes that remembered their roots. He had known the Adabio Foundation when it still had a roster of volunteers and a name everyone could say without hesitation. Adabio? He said, not loudly, but with the weight of recognition. The word landed like a stone. A woman nearby glanced up, her fork suspended mid-air. Conversation tried to restart, then faltered. A man standing with a glass in his hand asked, "Do you mean the Adabio Foundation? Anna Adabio?" The tide changed in a few breaths. Curiosity sharpened into recollection. Names like doors opened. Faces looked at Anna not as a supporting prop, but as the center of a story they had once known and then set aside. A photograph from memory slid into place. A schoolroom that had gotten renovated, a grant application approved, a summer program that had kept teenagers out of trouble. The room remembered in fragments what someone else had done. Clara, who had rehearsed the moment of humiliation with a calm she mistook for power, felt the air around her rearrange. She had imagined ridicule. She had not imagined ignorance becoming the wound that would turn against her. Her smile thinned. She watched as polite laughter was replaced by a murmur of names and dates. Her hand, which had been ready to direct scorn, found no audience that wanted to play along. Anna stood at the edge of the circle of attention and let the recognition reach her without claiming it like a trophy. One older guest crossed to her with a slow dignity, the kind that comes from a life spent reconciling accounts of public good. He extended a hand and, with the slight tremor of sincerity, said, "Anna Adabio, I thought it might be you. My wife worked with your foundation years ago." The name on everyone's lips now carried what it had once carried: history and work and responsibility. Conversations pivoted from mockery to apology, from gossip to curiosity. People leaned forward to hear more, not to laugh, but to understand. Stories were nudged out of memories. Offers of help took shape as sentences. "We should talk. There must be records. There's funding if the work is still worthy." Clara tried to speak into the gap she had created. Her words came thin, an effort to turn the scene back to the script she had written. But the script had ended the moment the room remembered what Anna had been and was. Her attempt at control slipped like a hand from a wet surface. She left quickly, the measured departure of someone who wants to leave before the stain of her bad intent dries. Anna faced the crowd and for the first time in years let her voice be heard in a room that had once known and then forgotten her name. Her words were small and precise. She did not deliver a theatrical rebuke. She did not make the moment a stage for vengeance. Instead, she spoke about what mattered, about programs, about children who had outgrown the lottery of opportunity, about the work that needed steady hands and a plan. She explained simply that the foundation had roots, and that roots sometimes got trampled, but that the people who had been helped still remembered. Several guests stepped forward with concrete things to offer: administrative support, introductions to funders, the promise to help locate archival documents. A couple of local donors, embarrassed by their distance from memory, expressed real regret and asked what might be done to help. None of these offers sounded like a lightning strike of instant revival. They sounded like hands extended across a table to begin repairs. Anna listened, and then she set a boundary. She would accept help where it served the work, she said, where it helped children get classes, and where it restored community rooms, and where it guarded against the conveniences of forgetfulness that allowed reputations and good work to be set aside. She refused, politely but firmly, offers to make the episode a spectacle for the social pages. She would not accept apologies that were only for appearance. She wanted partnership that would last beyond one evening's remorse. Clara watched the exchange, and something like shame seemed to move through her. Though shame is a quiet thing and not always easily read. She had expected to be applauded for her cleverness. Instead, she saw the architecture of influence turn for a moment into something with a conscience. Victoria, the CEO, felt it too. She had been present at the scene of the trap and had not intervened. In the hush after the recognition, Victoria found that her position required more than silence. She approached Anna later, privately. Her voice was low. It contained an apology that had weight because it came from a place of actual responsibility. "I didn't see," Victoria said. "I didn't understand what I didn't know. I'm sorry. If there's something to be done, if you want me to connect you." Anna accepted the apology without making it a currency. She asked for concrete steps instead of grand statements. She wanted records located, accounting cleared, and a plan to restore the programs that had served children. Victoria agreed to make introductions and to find staff who could help catalog what remained. That evening, an exchange of business cards read like a small treaty, promises made to be carried out. Clara left the garden without ceremony. The laughter that had gathered to make her plan succeed dispersed, replaced now by a feeling that can be harder to bear than a good joke. Responsibility. People who had been complicit in the readiness to mock had to meet the awkwardness of undoing a past action. Some did so with grace, others with the discomfort of a social bruise. Outside, Anna walked with Janet, their steps slow in the cool air. They did not immediately celebrate. There was no champagne for them, no triumphant pose in pictures. What happened felt like the opening of a door that had been nailed shut years ago. It would take time, effort, and patience to rebuild programs and to restore a name to its rightful place in the ledger of civic life. Anna understood that no single evening would erase years of neglect. She had not come to the wedding for revenge. She had come because she wanted to test whether recognition could translate into repair. "People will talk," Janet said, practical and hopeful at once. "Some will fade, some will help. We'll draw up a list. We'll find the files. You don't have to carry this by yourself anymore." Anna folded her hands around the brooch Janet had given her and let the garden's light fall across the metal. The weight of the object was small and, in its smallness, exact. It did not make her regal, as if a crown had been placed on her head. It reminded her only of the fact that there had been a life of meaning stitched into her past, and that meaning could be reknit into the present. When people approached with offers, she took inventory. She accepted practical help. People who could help with records, contacts at City Hall, someone who had archival experience, and another who knew fundraising. She politely refused offers that sought to make the story about pity or spectacle. She wanted substance, not a headline. In the days that followed, the story traveled in ways she had not imagined. An article mentioned in passing that Anna Adabio had been seen at the Hawthorne Tower. Social feeds collected images and comments. Some people wrote with kindness, some wrote with curiosity, a few with the indulgent cruelty that had once been their currency. But underneath the chatter, smaller, steadier threads took shape. Messages from old volunteers, a typed list of summer programs with dates and contact numbers, a woman giving the names of a legal aid group that might help with the paperwork, a former teacher offering to help design curricula. The offers were not miraculous. There was no sudden flood. But they were real, practical, anchored in the kind of steady work that rebuilds things carefully. Anna and Janet met with a handful of people who remembered the foundation and who were willing to help pore through files and re-establish accounts. They found records in attics and basements, in folders left in the drawers of someone who had once been the board secretary. The work was tedious sometimes and grief-struck at others. To find a grant approval from nearly a decade ago and discover that projects had been abandoned midstream. Anna found herself holding notes from projects she had once overseen and reading them like a survivor reading an old map. She also found evidence of the work that had not stopped. People who had carried on quietly, teachers who had refused to let programs die, volunteers who had kept rooms open out of stubborn love. Those fragments brought a kind of consolation. The legacy had not been entirely erased. It had been deferred, waiting for someone to gather it back into a plan. As offers to help became meetings and meetings became plans, Anna's position shifted from respondent to leader. She began to convene. A small group of local educators, a few donors who had newly remembered their commitments, a representative from the community center that had once collaborated with the foundation. She accepted technical support from people with skills she lacked, and took the helm in naming priorities. It required the old kinds of choices she had once been accustomed to: fiscal decisions, program placements, a negotiation between what was imaginable and what was feasible. She also set boundaries around her own intent. She did not seek revenge. She refused to make the evening at the Grand Magnolia a spectacle that would feed tabloids. Her purpose was not to humiliate those who had humiliated her. Rather, it was to restore dignity to the people who had been served, and to ensure that the infrastructure of aid could be rebuilt on better, more conscious terms. People were surprised by her restraint. Some expected retaliation, a dramatic unmasking. Instead, Anna brought lists and calendars. She spoke in meetings with the same directness she had used while sweeping a floor. Straightforward, thorough, mindful of the work at hand. Her leadership was not theatrical, it was administrative and warm, the kind of governance that asks who benefits and how to measure it. The old brooch she wore became an emblem among the small circle who worked with her. It was not a crown, it was a reminder that a name grounded in purpose carries responsibility. When journalists asked for statements, she gave concise answers. The work matters, the children matter, and the community deserves consistency. She declined certain interviews that sought to turn her ordeal into a spectacle. Her dignity was not a headline to be traded. In time, more commitments moved from talk to action. A local nonprofit offered to support bookkeeping until they could stabilize funding. A school offered classroom space for after-school activities. A retired administrator offered to help the foundation draft a new governance structure to prevent the kind of loss that once happened. None of these promises were instant transformation. Rebuilding takes patience. But the offers were real enough to make a plan feel plausible. Clara's presence in the community shrank in the face of responsibility. People who had once laughed with her now frictioned against the awkwardness of complicity. Some tried to smooth the river by making token statements. Others perhaps moved, quietly committed to making things right. It was a small reckoning, uneven and imperfect, but it was a reckoning nonetheless. There were moments when Anna allowed herself quiet satisfaction. Not in a petty takedown, but in the simple fact that the work she had once started had a chance to breathe again. She thought of the children who would walk into an after-school room that smelled of books and paint instead of dust and neglect. She thought of the volunteers who would find their way back because someone had bothered to catalog the names of those who had been helped. She also thought of the moral architecture of the evening at the Grand Magnolia. What had been planned as a joke had become a mirror. When power aligns itself with conscience, even for a single night, the patterns of a place can change. It did not cost Anna her peace to receive help. It required her to remain steady and discerning. She treated the crowd's sudden attention the way she treated spilt tea. Clean it up, set the cup aside, and decide whether to keep it in the house. Months passed. Meetings accumulated into concrete timetables. Grants were written and reviewed. Volunteers signed up. A modest crowdfunding initiative gathered donors who were moved by the story and by the practical plans presented. The Adabio Foundation did not resurrect overnight. It reformed itself cautiously and with safeguards into an organization bound by the lessons of the past. Anna often returned to the wooden box she had found under the towel. In it were the old photographs and the creased letter from Janet, and, now, a few new things. A small list of donors, a scan of an old grant approval, a photograph of a classroom that had held its original program. These items were not trophies. They were bookmarks in a story still being written. On a quiet morning, Anna stood in front of a diner window where she had once eaten her lunch alone between shifts. She watched her reflection, a woman with wet hair from the rain, the brooch pinned discreetly, the lines at the corners of her mouth gathered by work and thought. The reflection did not show a crown, only the steady arc of a woman who had remembered herself. Inside that reflection, she felt an internal shift like a crown being placed by invisible hands. Not a crown of entitlement, but a crown of responsibility, of memory, honored. She thought of Clara once in a while, not with bitterness but with a clear-eyed assessment of the kind of cruelty that prospers when people feel untethered from accountability. She thought of the guests at the gala who had chosen to speak up and those who had not. She thought of Victoria and the way conscience had pulled her into action. She thought of Janet, who had refused to allow an old friendship to be erased by scandal. The story had not turned on a single villain or a single savior. It had turned on the deliberate decision to seek repair over spectacle. There were days when the bureaucracy weighed heavy. There were arguments about priorities and disagreements about tactics. Anna learned the tight braid of diplomacy and firmness. She had to make decisions that disappointed some and comforted others. But each choice was a stitch toward something larger than one evening's humiliation. In gatherings with the community, Anna would sometimes speak simply. Names matter. Work matters. People deserve consistency. She reminded everyone that dignity did not come as a gift handed out at parties, but as a shared obligation. The gestures of goodwill that began at the Grand Magnolia translated into seatings at tables where strategy was made and resources allocated. It was the slow work of mending what had been frayed. One evening, as the sun lowered and the city lights warmed into the distance, Anna and Janet sat quietly at a kitchen table with a stack of documents between them. A grant application, a list of programs to relaunch, a calendar for tutoring. There was no fanfare, no cameras, just the low hum of refrigerators and the soft clink of a mug. Janet passed a pen across the table. "We begin here," she said, and Anna signed. She signed with the full weight of her name. It tasted different now than it had when she first found it folded in that wooden box. There was responsibility in the letters, and also light. The story that had begun with an invitation meant to mock had turned into something else, a rehearsal for repair. People who had been willing to laugh at a person were now faced with the option to help. Some would choose to walk away. Some would tuck their heads back into old habits. Others would give patiently and practically. Anna did not return to the Grand Magnolia to gloat. She did not demand the moment be turned into a spectacle for social feeds. Instead, she kept showing up where she was needed, at meetings, in classrooms, in the corners where children learned to read. Her dignity did not depend on applause. It depended on a name restored, not for vanity, but for the work that name represented. When the city paper ran a small piece about the foundation's relaunch, a photograph of Anna appeared in the layout. She was not posed for a showy shot. She stood with a group of volunteers, arms crossed, eyes steady. Under the photograph was a line that read simply, "Anna Adabio returns to lead new initiatives." The sentence was not triumphant. It was factual. That was enough. Sometimes, late at night, Anna would stand before a mirror and watch herself. The brooch caught a sliver of light and threw it back like a promise. She thought of the house where she had kept the wooden box, and of the small acts that had led her here. Refusing to be erased, leaning into a friendship that remembered who she had been, accepting help that would make the work sustainable. There was a humility in her stance now that came from the sort of experience one cannot fake. The knowledge that dignity is not granted by the wealthy, nor taken away by cruelty. It is held by those who continue to name the truth and act on it. Anna felt that crown internally, not an ornament but an alignment of life and purpose. At the edge of the frame of her days, she saw the work ahead like a path lit by small lamps. Each lamp was a meeting held, a program restarted, a child who learned to read because someone had bothered to remember that books were tools for life. There was no miraculous overnight redemption. There was the work of rebuilding, and that work appealed to the steady part of her. Janet squeezed her hand one evening as they left a planning session. "This is only the beginning," she said. The words were soft and true. Anna nodded. She felt tired and resolute at the same time, like soil that has been turned and is being prepared to receive seed. The world had tried to make a joke of her. Instead, she used that moment to remind others of what had been lost and what could be found again. People offered apologies and opportunities. Some of those offers carried the weight of real repair. She accepted what served the work and declined what would turn service into spectacle. As she walked home that night, Anna caught her reflection in a shop window. The woman in the glass stood tall, not because the world had declared her so, but because she had reclaimed the right to stand. Her reflection was not a crown for show, but a quiet, internal crown built from choices. To remember, to lead, to restore. If you found this story meaningful, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Stories like Anna's remind us that dignity is not a luxury, but a responsibility we owe one another. If you want to follow Anna's journey as the Adabio Foundation begins its work again, subscribe for more updates and for stories about the people who choose to rebuild things that matter.